do have in front of us, it has to be said, the example of what happens when governments don't win making that appeal. It's a disaster, and people end up chasing wage rises. Basically what's happening with the rail strike is one set of workers is striking against everybody else, and what they're trying to do is push up everybody else's rail travel costs, at which point everyone else will say, well, in which case I'm going to charge you, the railway worker, more to eat in the restaurant, or more to pay for your food costs at home, or more to pay for your washing powder. That's what will happen, and everyone will chase up the cost until eventually we realize that won't work anymore, and then everyone will be unemployed.
In fact, I posted this on Twitter earlier, saying, I don't know, all the talk of going back to the 1970s, does that work? And I said you needed to be well into your 60s to have any real concept of what it was like. To several generations, the 70s is a distant time of cool music, films and fashion. And lots of people, but I'm 54 and I remember the bins not being collected. So, okay, so you need to be in your 50s. But it is still a very long time ago. And does all this sort of rhetoric work, Danny?
Well, there are two things about it. First of all, obviously, it doesn't work in terms of lots of the electorate don't know what it means. Even though I'm about to turn 60, I was actually, a school child through most of the 1970s. But secondly, one of the reasons why the 1970s happened was because people voted for it. So in repeated elections, when Ted Heath, for example, asked who governs Britain, the choice was, well, not you if you can't manage the relationship with the trade unions. And it was only when that approach really hit the buffers right at the end of that decade that Margaret Thatcher won, and even then she didn't win by a lot. So it's worthwhile remembering that those political battles over trade unions fighting for preservation of their living standards against rising costs, the government doesn't always win those battles, and politically.
You're right. I mean, we had 4 general elections in the 1970s. We've only matched that again since in this decade.
We do have in front of us, it has to be said, the example of what happens when governments don't win making that appeal. It's a disaster, and people end up chasing wage rises. Basically what's happening with the rail strike is one set of workers is striking against everybody else, and what they're trying to do is push up everybody else's rail travel costs, at which point everyone else will say, well, in which case I'm going to charge you, the railway worker, more to eat in the restaurant, or more to pay for your food costs at home, or more to pay for your washing powder. That's what will happen, and everyone will chase up the cost until eventually we realize that won't work anymore, and then everyone will be unemployed. And that we've been through that experience, and it would be dispiriting to do it again. But there are lots of things that we experienced that people do seem like the sort of chase to establish some great global alternative to capitalism. We've tried that as well, and people have forgotten what a disaster that turned out to be as well.
Is going back to would you relish going back to the old days, David?
I love Danny's idea that people voted for the 70s, as if on the ballot paper you could have said, no, let's skip straight to the 80s. I missed this one out. Though I think I know what he meant. One of the things I've been very interested in, as somebody who really does remember this time, I remember the 3-day week of 1973, the power cuts. I remember the winter of discontent incredibly well. I remember the advent of Margaret Thatcher. British Leyland, all this kind of stuff. And I was cut my early journalistic teeth on the end of this kind of period going into the miners' strike in 84, 85. And what I thought was really dispiriting this week has been the return to kind of really dead old rhetoric. I mean, as if it related to people anymore, and to the old kind of dead old memes. Really, the thing is, and Dan is obviously absolutely right. The problem with getting into an inflationary spiral, as opposed to experiencing a bit of inflation, is that essentially you build into your expectations, into your behaviours, the notion that prices will go up, and you charge accordingly, you plan accordingly, and you demand accordingly. And that leads you eventually to 12, 13, 14, 15, 16% inflation. And that's not funny. It's extremely disruptive and so on. But the problem is, given how long it is since we had that level of inflation, and given how it's caused, you're in the business of persuading people, of telling them about it, of having the argument properly about it so that they can see it for themselves and make sure that you're kind of adjudicating it as fairly as you can. So immediately to kind of slam the unions as being kind of sort of terrible old left-wing people who are only out for themselves, for instance, on one side, and if we're talking about governmental responsibility, it won't work. It's not an act of persuasion. It doesn't get rail workers to say, let me kind of think about this. Maybe I don't want to do
It is a bit true of the RMT, though, David. I mean, the phrase you use is true of them. That they are out for themselves, because it's hard to believe that when you look at, the distribution of wages to everybody in the economy, that you would light upon railway workers as the group of people that's differentially worse off compared to everybody else. And secondly, it is due to some sort of bloody-minded theory about the way the society is organised, which completely doesn't work. So while I agree with you completely, because I'm always for reasonable dialogue, I suppose this does meet my kind of view that I have a sort of strong impatience for the position of the RMT, because I don't think ultimately that it's reasonable, and I've also got strong impatience for those people who say the government should be trying to settle this. What they mean by that, and they should say that if they mean it, is the government should try and buy off this strike, and I don't think the government should try and buy off the strike.
It's interesting.
But the thing. Sorry, I just wanted to add to that, Matt. What you're saying would be true if we had the same kind of trade union legislation as we did back in the 70s and 80s. But the fact is that in order to get to a strike, the RMT's members have to agree with it. And by the time you get to, so it's not as if it's just kind of the old days. You get your union leadership. They'd be very militant. They go out to a yard where everybody had to put up their hands, etc. They'd vote for the strike, and then everybody else would be picketed out. That's not what they do now. So you are in the act of persuasion with the RMT's own members.
People vote for all sorts of unreasonable things. They voted for Donald Trump, right? So just because they voted for it in an election doesn't mean to say that I have to think they're right. No, a whole bunch of them are wrong.
No, of course you do. But as with Donald Trump supporters, or some of them at any rate, you're in the business of persuading them of the alternative vision that you have and why it's a mistake. And not only that, by so doing, you've also got to persuade succeeding groups of potential strikers, etc., why this would be a mistake. And you've got to show that, as I said, you're adjudicating it fairly. Your point earlier, which is absolutely right, about how a relatively well-paid group who are very well organised, like rail workers, can essentially are the sort of people who will be able to have an effect through strike action, which will put up prices, etc. But classically, the poorer paid workers or the low-paid workers will be the people in the end who suffer, because they're on the whole, their strike action won't count. They won't be able to do it. They won't be that organised. Trade unions are much less organised across the piece than they were in the 70s and 80s and so on. And so actually what you have, and you're absolutely right in this, is a total inequality of suffering as a consequence of this. But that's got to be argued through. You can't just do it from a position of condemnation.
No, one of my main methods of persuasion is resistance, right? The most important thing is that anyone can assert. And let's face it, nobody who works on the railways is so incredibly well paid or in such a stable job that they don't feel, with a perfect reason, that for all the hard work they do, wouldn't be a good thing if they earned more money and they were more stable. And I'm sympathetic to anybody who feels that. Everybody feels that, however well off they are. And so I completely understand why they feel that, and I completely understand why they're taking whatever power they've got to try to impress that upon other people. And I will try to persuade them it's a bit antisocial, but and in the most temperate and moderate and intelligent way that I can. But the other thing to do is to simply say, no, this method that you're using to prevent everyone from going to work in order that you can exploit the monopoly power of the railways by causing maximum inconvenience to boost your wages at the expense of other people will not work. And because we're insistent that it will not. And that is the most important way of making a persuasive argument.
One of the things, particularly because of the phrase, the dead rhetoric that's being used, one of the things that struck me is I spoke to the guy from the head of Network Rail a little bit earlier on, who actually laid out, for me anyway, far more clearly what the issues are and the sticking points. And the particular examples of working practices which the RMT are wedded to, which lots of people in modern Britain would think were perhaps ripe for reform. But actually, the government's not even really doing that. They're not really making the case. I suppose that's the point, isn't it? That they're not. The government isn't really persuading people either. It's just going, oh, it's 1970s and it's Labour's strikes. No, I think lots of people just don't understand what all of this is about.
Yeah, Tory MPs are going out with the hashtag thank you Keir across this one. And it's just kind of, there are embarrassments for the Labour Party. And it's certainly so. For instance, you've got the Scottish Labour leader on the picket line, whereas at the same time, shadow cabinet members are being told to keep off the picket line because Labour's position wants to be, we are on the side of the ordinary public and we want to see this settled rather than we're on the side of the strikers or we're on the side of the employers, which is a very sensible position, but is really difficult to maintain in a situation of polarisation because a lot of your side actually quite like to go on picket lines and make fists, make little fists, etc., and say we're with the workers because that's what they feel emotionally, and that's another way in which you kind of find yourself whizzing back to the rhetoric of the 70s with total polarization, as if we didn't have in this country some very common set of attitudes. And the other part of the problem we have, frankly, is that since nobody believes a bleeding word this government says or trusts it in any kind of a way, every time it tries to polarize the argument and so on, it doesn't really work. It actually makes things worse.
Well, it's not my chosen form of rhetoric, this thanks Keir stuff and everything, because I do agree with it. It's a bit childish, but it's not, but I don't, and it's a bit tiresome, and I'd of course prefer people to make decent arguments, but let's not be naive about that. I don't, what people say when they say the government should do more settle the railway strike is they should concede more, and I'm not sure that's the correct strategy.
But isn't
I think it will create more strikes.
Doesn't it point to the general tenor of this government that nothing is their fault? They are new. Nothing that happened under Theresa May or David Cameron had anything to do with them. These strikes are Keir Starmer's fault. The energy bill rises are Ukraine's fault. They appear to be not in any way masters of their own destiny.
I'm very critical of that whole strand, but this strike isn't their fault. Then we ought to be able to make that intellectual distinction.
But if it's not their fault, it's definitely not Keir Starmer's fault.
Well, it is at least partly the Labour movement's fault, and certainly there's a lot of confusion in the Labour movement about whether they wish to encourage it. But I agree. Let's not get down this route, because I would agree with you very strongly and with David that it is a diversion to try to politicise it as though it was all about Keir Starmer. It's not. It's not really about Keir Starmer, right? So I don't want to get myself. I don't want to get myself.
This might be the first time ever, Daddy, but I'm going to have to disagree with you. This rail strike is not Keir Starmer's fault.
Right, he didn't cause the strike. That's true. The Labour movement believes that you can bid up wages in this way, and I do think that by telling the government that, by urging the government to negotiate with the strikers, he's encouraging that activity. So I think it's a mistake. But I would say this. Essentially, your point is correct. Of course, he didn't create the strike. I'm not saying that. I don't want to. By saying I'm not saying that, imply more than I imply. I am critical of his position. I do think the Labour movement is in the wrong position of it. But I agree that approaching it through the whole, thanks Keir, and pretending it's all about the Labour Party is a bit silly, right? But I thought
we were all going to disagree for a minute.
No, but at the same time, I would also disagree that this is the government's fault. I think this is the railway workers' fault. I think the railway workers think that they can, and the railway unions' fault. And I think they think that they can bid up their wages in this way, and they can't be allowed to do that. And anyone who's urging us to settle with them, is urging us to give into that, which will create other people doing the same thing.
Let's talk about what's happened to Emmanuel Macron in France. He's lost his majority in Parliament. He's going to have to try and cobble together some sort of deal so he can get anything done. I mean, and lots of people in France would be saying it's because he took it all for granted, didn't campaign, went to Ukraine for 3 days. What can we read into all of this, David?
I think you can read into it the fact that the French electorate have worked out how to get what they want out of an election. system which was designed to prevent them. I mean, that's what I read into it. We knew from the first round of the presidential voting, before it's kind of narrowed down to two, that there are significant forces on the far right and on the far left that actually deserve parliamentary representation because many people vote for them. But we also know that the weight of the French voters lay within the centre and the centre right. And that is reflected in the votes for Macron's party and for the Republican Party. And I would therefore expect them to have to do what everybody else has to do, except in places like Britain and America, which is to do some deals about what it is they're going to have to do in order to get their program through, because they haven't actually got a majority of voters. And we knew that anyway, because we know that from the presidential election. So we love in this country, and partially the French encourage us in this, to say that everything and anything is a disaster for the French president and that France is a basket case, when in fact France has done considerably better than we have over the course of the last decade or so, etc. And so my prediction is, for what it's worth, is that he will manage this. Now, we need him to manage it as well, because when it comes to things like foreign policy and so on, Macron's instincts and those of probably of the of section of the Republicans are far more robust when it comes to things like Ukraine and Putin, for all the criticism that we've put against him, than those of, say, the opposition parties, either Marine Le Pen or the far left parties in the French Parliament. So in addition to thinking that this will be what happens, we also, I think, have to hope that that's what happens from a British perspective.
Danny, I suppose David's right, isn't it? Even if people don't like the idea of the far left or the far right, if there is support for them, then they should be in the Parliament.
When I saw the whole mess, I thought, thanks, Keir. No, I didn't really. So I think, in addition to David's points, I basically agree with, but I think particularly the last one about Macron's importance in France. But I do worry about the rise, sort of obvious point, but I worry about the rise of populism on left and right in France and in Europe, as I have in this country. I think it's it was concerning in the presidential election, and this was the kind of manifestation of itself. It's very good that in the end, in the presidential election, when people are given a binary choice, he still managed to win quite convincingly. But when people aren't, it is worrying that we've ended up in this position, and I worry that it'll go further, and that at some point it will not be dominant in the presidential election. So it was these are worrying moments.